Basically, what we want to go through today for Safe Work Month is a presentation on the HSE and design requirements. My name is Gavin Swain. I have been helping Nicole and the team go through the requirements to get in place some of the documentation and processes we need to make sure we comply. So I'll be going through that today and just explaining what the process is, what our requirements are, and how we can ensure we meet our requirements for clients and for legislation as well. The agenda itself, there'll be a very short disclaimer I need to just run through. I'll talk about what is HSE in design, very briefly the harmonisation laws at a higher level. I'm not going to go into the differences in each state and in the differences between Australia and New Zealand. The duties of designers, key 5 elements that all of us need to understand in terms of our requirements to deliver the correct HSE and design elements. HSE and design process itself and how we've structured it in Logicams, the procedures and other documents that support this process, how information transfer is done, and then any questions at the end. So this will take a bit of time to go through, but more than welcome to host questions after the slides are finished. Alternatively, for those who would like to take a bit more time to digest the information and can contact me later about any issues. Disclaimer. So the statements within this presentation that relate to legally binding documents, such as acts and regulations that apply within a jurisdiction, are included only to assist to explain HSE and design. The reason we've put this statement in there is because at the end of the day, the documentation we've produced is our interpretation of the Act and regulations. However, the binding documents that we all live and breathe to by our governments are the actual acts and regulations. So while we try to interpret exactly our understanding of what they mean, if you want to know what the binding documents are, it's the acts and regulations. So readers are advised that these statements have no legal bearing and that readers should always refer to the wording within the legal binding documents with respect to the correct legal interpretation. Next slide we're looking at, so this is what are the benefits of safe design. So the reason that as a consultant and a deliverer of services and that, we want to make sure our designs are safe, so they for the prevention and reduction of fatality, injury or disease, to improve the functionality of a product, a system or facility that we're providing, to improve the productivity of an operation for a client, reduce the costs throughout the project lifecycle by considering safe design aspects, improve the product predictability of production and operating costs, our compliance with legislation, and safe design also enhances critical thinking and innovation, and in some cases can actually reduce insurance premiums as we're producing safe designs, and that reduces the premiums for our clients. What is safety in design? Safe design means the integration of control measures early in the design process to eliminate, or if this is not reasonably practical, minimise risks to health and safety throughout the life of the facility or product being designed. So safe design begins at the concept design phase when making decisions about the design and its intended purpose, the materials to be used in the product, the possible methods of construction, maintenance, operation, demolition or dismantling and final disposal, and what legislation, codes, practice and standards need to be considered to comply with. So they're all things, and as designers we have enormous influence on those elements in terms of creating a safe design. Just briefly, this all came about with in Australia, and New Zealand has followed this as well, from a strategy set up in 2012, the COAG between all the governments across the country, looking at how to produce health and safety and productivity working lives. And from that there was a number of elements produced, and one of those elements, which is shown there, is health and safety by design, and that's what we're focusing on today. The reason this is important to Australia and New Zealand, and from a statistics point of view, In terms of deaths or fatalities in work sites, well over 200 people was occurring per year. It was in the order of 2,000 workers dying from work-related illnesses each year. These are from a lot of the practices in the past. There's over 300,000 workers were compensated for injuries in recent years, and it's been calculated that to the Australian economy in the financial year 2008 and 9, that $60 billion was attributed to fatalities and injuries and illness at work, which equates to about just under 5% of the Australia's gross domestic product. So the drive here was to try and obviously save people's lives, reduce injuries, and from a monetary perspective, the cost on the economy. Okay, so HSE and design, basically, if we look at this triangle here, which shows us how the Act regulations and the various other elements fall together, basically Safe Work Australia was created as a principal national organisation driving national policy development in work health and safety. Works in partnership with the governments and employer and employee associations. And as I mentioned before, in 2015 there was 195 work-related fatalities. That's still far too high. However, the number is reducing from where it was in 2003. 45 work-related fatalities in New Zealand in 2015. And from a population perspective, the ratios are similar, with New Zealand being slightly higher than Australia. If you look at this diagram here, we have the Act and regulation at the top, which exist in New Zealand, across New Zealand, and also exist in most of the states except for Western Australia and Victoria. In terms of the harmonisation laws, they have still got their original Act and regulations. But regardless, whichever jurisdiction we're working in, Act and regulations are mandatory. We have to follow those, and people who don't can be prosecuted. Codes of practice fall below that, and standards like the Australian standards and the industry guides and standards also apply. However, they're not mandatory. So codes of practice are not mandatory, they're only a guide, standards are a guide, and industry standards and guidance notes are only guides. So the reason that they are guides is because there's various ways to do things to mitigate risk, and for that reason they're not mandated practices. Okay, from the harmonisation law, so that was developed and it was rolled out in all states except Victoria and Western Australia, and New Zealand has adopted the same model. It was developed from the COAG, and it's basically uses very similar wording. There's just a few little changes, and the numbering is slightly different. So the Act talks, the Model Act in Section 16, which is actually Section 33 in the New Zealand model, talks about the duties made and the principles that apply to duties. So now we're talking about our duty of care. Where more than one person has a duty for the same matter, each person retains responsibility for their duty and must discharge it to the extent at which the person has the capacity in Australia and ability in New Zealand to influence or control the matter. While designers may not have management or control over the actual construction work, they can discharge the duty by consulting, cooperating and coordinating activities where reasonably practical with those who do have management or control over the construction work. Very important too that the Model Act did not use the word communications, instead push that down to the three words of consulting, cooperating and coordinating, meaning that as duty holders we all have a responsibility to do those three things in respect to the scope that we're covering. And that applies to meeting all work health safety regulations and obligations. And one way that we can demonstrate that we do that is simply like site instructions often put on drawings as one way of communicating with people and ensuring that proper discharge of our duties as designers to constructors and people like that. We'll just take this a bit further, and this diagram here, this umbrella in the background, sort of shows how the model works in terms of our duties of care. So Section 16 or 33 that we just looked at is our duty of care. From that, the Model Act then expands out to look at the primary duty of care, which is under section 19 and 36, and that's basically a person conducting a business or undertaking and their responsibilities. So Logicams is obviously a person conducting a business and undertaking. Our clients are, constructors are, and various other organisations that we work with. The model has been quite prescriptive in the way it's been developed and set up, in terms that there's a number of other sections within the Act that talks about the responsibilities of those who manage and control of workplaces, like clients, those that are in the management of or control of fixtures, fittings and plant. So that might be like in a building, it might be the actual manager of the building itself, not the actual owner. A manufacturer of a product, a designer like we are, installers, constructors and commissioners, which we do, or we have them working for us, suppliers and importers. And there's onuses on within those sections to ensure that as a duty holder, you go and seek information about risks and how designs are to be used and installed, and we have a duty to also partake in terms of sending or distributing information about our designs and what we know about the risks associated with any that we're involved in. I won't dwell too much on the acts and regs, but this last section here is section 18, and what is considered reasonably practical in relation to a designer. So this is section 8, which is section 18, which is and 22 in New Zealand, which relies purely to the requirements for a designer, taking into account and weighing up. So from a risk perspective, this is the things that we need to consider from a hazard or a risk point of view. The likelihood of a hazard or a risk occurring, the degree of harm that may result, the expected knowledge about the hazard or risk and ways of controlling the risk, options to eliminate and minimise the risk. So once you've looked at all those aspects from a design perspective, then you can actually then consider after assessing the risk and the ways of eliminating or minimising the risk, is the cost grossly disproportionate to the risk. So basically what they're saying is you need to do all those 4 elements above first in considering how we manage hazards, but then obviously it's got to be in the context of what's considered appropriate risk and the cost of introducing a mitigation action to eliminate that risk or minimise that risk to as far as we possibly can. Okay, so what does that mean from a safety and design perspective, or HSE and design? So basically for us to comply, when we do designs and we do installation and construction work, there's 5 elements that if we follow these 5 elements, then we pretty well cover our requirements under legislation. So one of those is to use a risk management approach. That's basically using a risk-based approach where you're identifying hazards and then working through the mitigation requirements for those hazards. Considering the life cycle of the product, so not just how it's going to be designed, built and installed, but actually how it's going to be operated, maintained and eventually how it will be disposed of. Ensuring when we do design that we have safe design knowledge and capability, so we have the right people involved, from clients, constructors, OEM suppliers, experts within our own organisation, appropriate for the particular job that we're doing, that we have the right knowledge there and the capability. Well, you have to make sure that we're ensuring there's consultation, cooperation and coordination with all those parties involved. And then finally, the transferring of information. So if there is known risks that we can't completely mitigate, we may need to make sure that parties downstream will be aware of what they are. And basically all those elements are things that we do today anyway, and they're really part of the overall Logicam's engineering process and the framework. So HSE and design is really not so much a new thing, it's just elements of the way that we design, from getting client requirements, design inputs, design outputs, to producing a product and checking it along the way. Okay, if you look at the first element, using a risk management approach. So basically this is in 4 steps, and this is available from the Codes of Practice. And basically what we're trying to do here is, firstly, for any design we do, is identifying the reasonably foreseeable hazards associated with the design. Secondly, assessing the risks arising from those hazards. If those risks are known, if we know the risk and the control, then we can use established controls. So, when people first get introduced to safety and design, they think, well, we've got to run a HAZOP and do all those sorts of things. Well, in some cases you do, but if it's applying standards that have already been accepted in the industry and are adequate and control the risks associated with this design, then they can be those standards can be used. So an example of that is if you're doing a set of stairs and a platform, then there is the various Australian standards that we follow that cover the requirements for there. So Australian Standard 1657 is for fixed platforms, walkways, stairways, ladders, design, construction, installation. So if we're following that and there's no other risks outside of what we normally expect on a set of stairs and a platform, then we've basically done our requirements under HSE and design by following that standard. And that's what basically this arrow through here means, using the known risks and control. Another example of that is our wiring rules. So AS3000, by applying AS3000, then we are ensuring that we are applying a standard of for known risks and how we control those risks. However, if there's hazards identified in a project that are beyond what our Australian standards and things like that can mitigate the risk, then we need to go to step 2, which is assessing the risk. And in assessing the risk, you go into more formal processes of HAZOPs and other methods of going through the hazard identification, the risk mitigation, and how you're going to control that in a design perspective. Obviously, step 3 is all those control risks that we're aware of need to be managed, either through a standard or through what we've done through our workshops, and come up with solutions to mitigate these risks. And then there needs to be a process of review and control those measures as we close out designs and then move those designs to implementation. Notice that consultation is considered at all steps, so it's a very important part that all the way through you must be consulting with the right people within Logicams and within clients and with the various other organisations that we interface with. So from a risk management approach, under the regulations, there's part 1 of general duties, and this is a fairly lengthy section of the regulation. It goes for a number of pages, and it talks about how to manage risk. So you're more than welcome to look at that for any of your states. But basically, obviously, our first approach is to eliminate a risk. If we can't, a hazard, then we go to methods of minimisation right through to administrative controls and personal protective. That process that we've used, and in some cases on projects we will have a number of those mitigation strategies. It's very important that other duty holders are aware of the process we've used and what risks still exist in the design, and what they need to do then to handle those risks. So we must always aim to eliminate a risk, which is the most effective control. But if this is not reasonably practical, we must minimise the risk by working through the other alternatives in the hierarchy in that order. Okay, so that's the first element, a risk management approach. Next one, we must consider the life cycle. So under Section 22 or 39 in New Zealand of the Act, requires a designer to ensure, as far as reasonably practical, that the plant, substance or structure is designed to be without risk to health and safety of persons who use the plant, substance or structure, handle the substance, store the substance or plant, construct the structure, carry out any activity in relation to manufacture, assembly, use, proper disposal, and are at or in the vicinity of the workplace and are exposed, although those health and safety may be affected. So basically what that's saying is that you on any sort of site, you must consider all these things in terms of the solution we're supplying to a client, and we must also consider those that might be in the vicinity that are not directly related, which may actually be the public in some cases, that they have been considered in terms of the activities that we'll be undertaking when you're constructing or operating a part of the plant. And the thing with the life cycle, and from this diagram here, you can see that often the life cycle of the designs that we get involved in, the planning and design phase is reasonably short. The construction commissioning phase is slightly longer. The operating, maintaining, and often upgrading or renewal phase can be quite long. And then the eventual decommissioning and disposal is at the end. So we need to consider that whole life cycle. And the effects of these sorts of acts and regulations can be seen often in things like clothing these days, which often come with a long tag attached, which talks about all the requirements of how, in terms of any risks associated with those products, and how you have to cut those off before you use a garment. So that's just an indication of the influence it's had on our ensuring that people are aware of the risks and how to use and operate and discard products. Third element to consider is safe design knowledge and capability. You can't always have the best experts in the world there, but you need to have the right people involved to have the right understanding of the risks associated. And those people need to be from the client's perspective, from us, maybe from suppliers, OEMs, constructors, and those sorts of things. And it's all has to be obviously in balanced as opposed compared to the type of work. So it's a very simple project. There might not be that many people involved. It's quite a complex and expensive and long drawn-out project, and you might have quite a number of people involved in providing that expert knowledge. So as designers, we should have knowledge of the OH&S legislation and regulations and any mandated standards. Understand the full life cycle of the types of processes, facilities and structures that we're developing. Hazard risk, hazard identification and risk assessment and control methods. So the project itself either needs to adopt the client system or adopt our own system. Have understanding of the technical design codes and standards that apply to that design. Understanding of the relevant data on human dimensions, capacities and behaviours, so that we're not installing, say, a valve in a pipeline that makes it very difficult for an operator to get to from an ergonomics point of view. And how to integrate the knowledge from a range of sources and disciplines. And yes, you can see there on the screen, there's just a number of places, an enormous amount of places where we can get various bits of information, codes of practice and different things like that to help us in understanding the particular ways of approaching design in certain industries. From an internal perspective, there is supporting documents that Claire looks after. In the quality management system, they're listed there. There's spreadsheets that talk about the legislation in terms of our legal and other obligations. There's also environmental documents as well, in covering the aspects and impacts register, and also, and these are all divided up based on the various jurisdictions. So you can go in and have a look at those documents and have access to live links to the latest versions. Fourth one is consultation, cooperation and coordination. So from a safe HSE and design perspective, consultation is considered a legal requirement and essential part of managing work health and safety risks. Consulting, cooperating and coordinating activities with other duty holders. So when it comes to in Australia, except for Victoria and Western Australia, in terms of the harmonisation laws under Section 46, a person conducting a business or undertaking must consult, cooperate and coordinate activities with all other persons. So that's basically going back to the umbrella diagram we were talking about before, that as designers we need to make sure we're talking to the people that may be manufacturing what we're designing, constructing what we're designing, we're talking with the client and various other people involved. Duties of persons who commission construction work. So if you're, as a client, you engage someone to do commissioning for you under Regulation 294, a person who commissions construction work must consult with the designer to ensure that risks arising from the design during construction are eliminated or minimised. So this puts the emphasis back on anyone who commissions someone to do construction for them, that they engage and consult with the designer to understand the risks associated with that design. Regulation 294 doesn't exist in New Zealand. However, they do have Section 30 of the Act 34, which is very similar to the one above, Section 49 for Australia. And basically, they've just changed the wording to say a PCBU must consult, cooperate and coordinate activities with all other PCUBs involved in construction or design activity. Okay, the last one is information transfer. So part of the designer's requirements under the legislation is that designers must give adequate information to each person who is provided with the design, the purpose of which the plant, substance or structure is designed, the results of calculations, testing, analysis and examination. So notice it's the results. So we do drawings, we do calculations, it's the outcome from those calculations onto drawings, those results that need to be transferred across to the client. Any conditions necessary to ensure that the plant, substance or structure is without risk to health or safety, and the information must cover the life cycle. So any manufacturing requirements, assembly requirements, use, proper demolition and disposal of the product at the end of the day. So under the transfer, there is one particular requirement under the regulation 295, which talks about the requirements of the designer must provide a written report to a person conducting a business or undertaking who commissions the design that specifies the hazards related to the design of the structure. So the only part in the Act or regulations that mentions a written report is for structures, and it's only for structures, only applies to design of structures that have unusual or atypical features which present hazards and risks during the construction phase that are unique to the particular design. The couple examples there, obviously if the Eiffel Tower was being built today, it's quite unique. The dome over in the UK is quite unique as well, and its requirements there. Any process plant is usually atypical, so it's quite unusual, it's a one-off, so we need to make sure that if we're involved in the design of that structure, that we're supplying that written report. And for instance, with things like the mountables and whatever else, why it's important that information is transferred is often we see where we may design for a large construction site, various construction offices and that have a life cycle of about 5 years and no longer, and often the client wants to then keep those structures for longer. So therefore, the emphasis is on the client then to come back to the designer and say, okay, is this structure safe enough to extend its life for, say, another 20 years or something like that. However, if we look at the overall requirements, information transfer, whether it's a written report or not, the emphasis is still on the designer to make sure that any known risks and hazards are transferred to other duty holders who may be affected, such as constructors, operators, anyone downstream. What have we done here then in Logicams? So in Logicams, we've created a procedure and a hazardous checklist. There's also a template we can use for a safety and design report. The procedure itself, when you have a chance to go through that, we've tried to keep it as simple and straightforward as we can, but however, there is a fair bit of information in there to get through those 5 elements that I mentioned. And it's basically been written based on the harmonisation model laws. And applies to all states and territories in New Zealand. Obviously, Western Australia and Victoria, while they haven't implemented the harmonisation model yet, in time they will, that their existing regs and acts basically have the same similar elements, so there's really no difference. As long as we're doing the correct due diligence as designers, then we can ensure we're doing the right thing by those that will use our designs. The checklist itself is broken down into disciplines and environment and various other sections. There is just a bit of a checklist that people can use to go through when they're looking at their design at various stages, or some of the things that might catch you out. Going into a little bit more detail, in the procedure itself, to help, we've created a A3 pull-out workflow. A bit hard to see there on the screen, but basically the left-hand side is, as we spoke about before, the design phases. So it's talking about the design phases down this side here, and then how the HSE and design elements dovetail into our design process. And then on this side here, it's actually got the typical activities that happen at each of these phases and the typical documents that may be produced. Now, the level of documentation and the amount of effort required is based on the complexity of the project and what's required. So for that example of a simple set of stairs with a platform, you know, we would produce a number of drawings to a certain Australian standard, 1657, and from that we would indicate what the requirements are in terms of how that structure would be installed. And so that's fairly straightforward, and there wouldn't be a lot of documentation or hazards that need to be transferred across to other duty holders. However, if we're doing a very complex process which involves chemical processing and things like that, obviously the risks associated will be a lot higher, and therefore a lot of more documentation would be produced. Just going through this workflow here, and I just want to talk about briefly what we do at each of these steps. So the first thing on any job, regardless of where we've picked it up, we need to, and whether others have done design work beforehand in terms of feasibility studies and things like that or not, first thing to do is really establish the context and the consultation method we're going to use. So how are we going to communicate with the client? Who's responsible for what? Are we principal contractor? Are we just on a design part of the scope? Have we got the right skills and competency in our group and the people that we're interfacing with? How that consultation is going to be done? What risk process is going to be used? Are we going to use the client's risk tables? Are we going to use our own? What information gathering needs to happen beforehand? Previous designs that may have been done for this part of the plant if we're doing an upgrade or something, and things like that. From there, and that's really, if we're doing a design criteria, will cover a lot of that information as well, or obviously our project execution plan. So if it's a big project, we'd have the project execution plan that goes over a number of pages. If it's quite a simple, easy, straightforward project, we would use the simple one-page project execution plan, which basically takes through a number of prompts to make sure that we're covering these elements up here. The next step after that is the hazard identification. So we need to identify any hazards from the design. We need to be able to do that. We need to have the right subject matter experts involved. And we need to consider things like maybe historical information or what happens in the industry, community or environment, and where things change. So while there's standards and codes of practice, things outside of those codes of practice can influence how we do design. And unfortunately, in recent times, with the threat of terrorism and a number of unfortunate events around the world, I think we've all seen that public places now are changing quite a bit, where barricades are being introduced to stop vehicles that can potentially drive into public areas. And so while the standards may not talk about those risks from a terrorist point of view, they're certainly known practices in the industry now, and anyone who's involved in a design that involves a public area would certainly need to ensure that elements like that were considered in terms of the hazards of the world that we currently live in. From after the identification of hazards, it's really going through the analysis then, analysing the hazards, whether they're high-risk hazards as identified in the regulations. Is anything unstable in the process that we're designing? Any siting issues, any work methods from operators or maintenance people that we need to consider? And then the risk rating, how are we going to do that? What's the consequence and likelihood in any other studies? So we may identify that if it's a ship loader or something like that, then obviously collision detection and things like that are as important with other structures, and so therefore we might go into more of a SIL-based approach to an additional analysis required in studies to handle that sort of example. Once the analysis, we've looked at the hazards and understand the hazards and what the potential are for those hazards, the next step is the evaluation. And in the evaluation, as I mentioned before, there's two paths you can go. The one way is the recognised standards. So if it's quite straightforward, there's standards out there that will mitigate the risks that we've identified, such as the Australian wiring rules and other standards, then A might be acceptable. If not, then we might have to go down to the more involved risk assessment process. And that may involve anything from event and fault tree analysis, SIL studies, constructability studies, HAZOPs, all those sorts of processes that we can use to try and understand and mitigate those risks. Most projects will definitely have some in the A category of using recognised standards, and we do that every day. So we're actually doing that as designers. We're obviously aware of the Australian standards and the New Zealand standards, and we follow those. But there may be some risks that do fall into category B. So I'd like to just emphasise on that it's not something new, it's something that we do every day. We just don't realise that, or always realise that we are practicing safety and design type approaches to things by understanding and using existing standards if they're adequate for the risk that's been identified. The treatment. So once we've understood how we're going to approach it, how do we treat that risk, and we'll do that through our design, and we use the hierarchy of control, the design measures that we use to either eliminate or certainly minimise the risks as much as we can. And in that process, we need to make sure our reviews are done as well, so that we understand that if we implement a certain mitigation strategy, that it's not going to introduce a further risk that was previously not identified because of the solution that we were previously looking at. So there's a bit of a cycle process there, I suppose, to go through to make sure that we fully understand all the risks associated with the design. We haven't introduced any new ones, and that we can close those out. And so this is very important. Our documentation comes in, because those risks that still exist that may be pushed down the hierarchy of control and end up being something that has to be managed through administrative controls or through PPE and things like that. All that information must be transferred to the owner of the plant, so that they understand, and then they can then take that risk register on further and use it for the life of that plant. Finally, reporting. So this is the information transfer. So we need to close out all the risks and make sure we've got buy-in by the client and everyone that we have successfully closed out risks to an acceptable level. There may be verification, either internal or external, that's involved. Sometimes third-party audits are required. Where there may be plant that needs to be registered, and there's also other reporting and deliverables and the transferring of those risks. So it's very important that if we are aware of certain risks and that we've mitigated the risk to as much as we can, but there's still a residual risk left, that we transfer that to those downstream who could be affected by it. So constructors, the client, maybe a contractor who does maintenance for the client, all those sorts of people. It's our duty to make sure that we disclose that information and formally transfer that information. Okay, who's responsible for HSE in design? Well, obviously a lot of it fits with the designer and the engineering team. However, everyone plays an important role here. So from a senior management perspective, the leadership within the organisation, all organisations, the client's organisation and ours, has a duty under their leadership to ensure that they are acting correctly as a PCBU, and they influence and control and make sure there's compliance within the organisation to meet our obligations under the regulations. And in doing that, they set policies and guidance framework that we can all work to and understand how together we can ensure we meet our requirements and produce safe designs for our clients. Project management. So on a project now, obviously the size, whether it's a large project or small, doesn't matter. There's always a project management element to it, and in that, the project management needs to ensure that the culture is set up and the processes are there to consult, cooperate and coordinate. So who do we know that we need to talk to on the client side? Who's the expertise? Who's going to give us the information that we need to understand about what the risks are on their site, how they run their business, how they run their operations, and how we can then use that information to influence the design. Manage the overall project risks and manage and control the project workspace. So this is, whether we're in the office here or out on site, we have a responsibility to ensure that the workplace that we're under our control that we understand the risks associated with it, and we're making sure everyone is safe who's operating in that area. Health, safety, environment and quality, so certainly through Nicole's team, they can provide some really good support and advice in understanding how we need to comply with the regulations, what the business is doing in terms of continuous improvement and getting information out there, and any safety related things that may be of interest to people. And things are changing all the time. So I had a look this morning just on some of the latest requirements for chemicals, and the federal government through all the states has put together a code of practice on chemicals, and one of the things is that 15 chemicals are now being identified as hazardous chemicals can be used by terrorists, and therefore they're looking at implementing improved ways to make sure that those chemicals are safe in the community. And that's just a reflection of the world that we live in. Risk management. So there's a risk management process, so we need to understand how we're going to handle risks, what sort of matrix we're going to use, and what guidance and how you go about closing things out. So as a designer engineer, if you're unsure how to handle hazards that have been identified in a design and how to close those out, please seek assistance from your line managers and different people who can help you in that process. Engineering has obviously the biggest component and drives this, and manages the technical risks in a design, and also manages the process of going through the hierarchy of controls, and then eventually formulating all the information together that then needs to be transferred to the client. Procurement. So procurement has an impact as well, because there's a number of aspects here. If we're getting vendor equipment, so one of the things we want to do is under those contracts is set out fairly early with those vendors what our expectations are with hazards and risks that they're aware of with their products and how they may affect our design. Also, as duty holders, you've got manufacturers, importers, suppliers and installers. So, and they all need to be considered from a consultation point of view and a compliance and expectations. So for instance, for a construction contract, it's not totally uncommon now for a constructor to make request as a duty holder, when he is awarded a contract, the risk register that you're using on the project, so that he can ensure that he understands what the risks are from a construction point of view for the design that we're doing, and therefore that he can then make sure that he approaches it the right way. If that information is not available when the contract is let, then in some cases some contractors may use that as a variation claim. So to avoid those sorts of situations, the best bet is to try and be upfront in your contract negotiations and things like that early on, so that those other duty holders are aware of when this information will become available from your design. Following on from there, obviously with the vendor data too, is to make sure that we're getting hold of from the OEMs all their information as well, if that's to be brought in and added to our information and then sent across to the client. Construction commissioning, so we need to get participation where we can from construction people who are inside the company, and also those construction companies that work with us, and so that there's hazards that we're aware of can be managed right through from the construction phase to practical completion and ramp up, and that the construction and commissioning components have the correct safe systems of work, and they understand the dangers that may exist or hazards that may exist with the design in terms of the construction perspective. Then eventually the client, so the client itself obviously has to have a lot of input into how they're going to run their operation, how they're going to maintain it, so they've got that participation, and how the hazard management will be managed through the life cycle of that plant, and what safe systems of work they need to put in place to hold that. And eventually, if they're going to do an upgrade to the plant or they're going to close that plant down, then as owners of that information, they need to take that through and then hand that to the duty holders that may be affected in those later activities. Okay, methods of transferring information. So, as I said, there's only one part of the regulation that talks about the requirement to have a written report, but the Act and regulation is quite strong on the fact that as a duty holder, we need to make sure that we're transferring the right information about risks, and that particularly those risks that have residual components still left, and that duty holders downstream understand how to work with those residual risks. So we might have a HSE and design report, depending on the size of the project. Generally, there's probably a technical risk register, which is obviously used through the project to identify the hazards and the methods used to close out those hazards. There may be safety data sheets related to equipment or processes or substances were used in the design. Hazardous area reports. There might be technical risk studies that look at fire and all sorts of other risks that are associated with our design. Manuals and procedures for safe installation, operation, maintenance, dismantling and demolition. And a project closeout report can be a way to just summarise all that information in a quite short and concise document. So what we're trying to say is that the information transfer, why we need to ensure that duty holders are aware of the hazards associated with the design. The amount of documentation we produce needs to be fit for purpose for the design. So it's a straight, simple staircase I mentioned before on a platform, set of drawings saying that we've used this Australian standard and all the calculations have been done for the size of the hold down bolts and things like that, and it's all correct, is enough to indicate our requirements and transfer that information to the client, and with the know-how of how to put that structure together. But if it's quite a complex structure that they're designing or building, then there's going to be more effort and more documentation required. So that's why, even though the legislation and acts now are a little bit more prescriptive about what's required, in some ways there's not a lot of change from what we've had in the past. It's just the case that we need to make sure that we're doing those 5 elements that I spoke about, and that the transfer of information is done in a formal sense. And that may be done in terms of, I've seen it done on a large civil project where we went to site and spent a few hours with the constructor, with the client, went through the risks associated with the civil works, and the set of minutes that were produced at the end of that was used as a method of transferring the information and all the known risks to the other duty holders. In a project, we need to consider the potential issues around when we release information related to safety and design. So, for instance, depending on the size of the job, there may be different stages. So if it's multidiscipline, there may be a civil component first, then a SMP type contract for the mechanical and structural, and then there might be after that electrical controls component. So the release of documentation may happen at different times. The inclusion of OEM and vendor information needs to be considered, and back to procurement, making sure we're getting that information so we're not waiting for things to close out our design. HSE and design information accompanying IFC drawings. So typically we want to wrap it up and issue any information related to HSE and design with the IFC package. Need to consider any issues that arise from open issues. So do we need to reissue information because we've got holes? So we might have, say for instance, we're waiting for a vendor to give us the hold down patterns for a large HV drive, and therefore we can't finish our platform design. So that will become a hold, and therefore we may have to issue documentation twice once that hold's been released. Multiple individual reports issued as construction occurs. So if we're on a job that has some maybe new plant, and then it's got some brownfield modifications which may happen 6 months later when the plant's brought down, we may need to consider breaking up our documentation that we hand over for those various stages. And the commercial considerations may influence when information is required as well. So that was back to that previous comment about ensuring that we understand from the design perspective when our hazards that we're transferring and risks that we're transferring to constructors and other duty holders, that we're talking to them as early as possible about when they're going to get that information, and so they don't potentially use that as a commercial tool against us in a contract situation. And then what's adequate for the next design phase. So obviously if you're doing a study and the design's only been taken to a certain point, then the level of documentation from the HSE design aspect of that design will be at a much higher level. But it needs to be captured and included in the final study documentation so that it can go to the next company doing the next phase of the work, which hopefully will be us, but could be others. So the adequate HSE and design information must be formally transferred to each person who is provided with the design. And that includes principal contractors, installers, constructors, commissioners, operators, maintainers and demolishers. Now we might not know who they are, and so in some cases we might be transferring that information to a client, and then it's the client's responsibility then to disseminate the right information to maintainers and other companies that they engage. But our duty is to make sure that we're transferring the information to the duty holders that we are engaged with. Okay. Finally, there is a suggested on the system design safety report. It's basically spelled out as some of the elements that you would look at in terms of on a larger project. Obviously, I'm not suggesting you go through this detail for smaller projects, and in a lot of cases, smaller projects, our HSE and design requirements are covered by Australian standards. However, if we are going to look at some of the things that we need to consider, and obviously, and in some cases, this can be just a reflection of whatever our original PEP document was, but description of the package of work, how it was designed, what the legislation requirements are, any sort of critical settings or parameters, and particularly in the control field that can be quite important, or drives where we might be changing the way a drive operates, so if there's any critical aspects of VSD or whatever that's communicated. Any reviews or studies that have been done and how we verified the process. Any open risks that still exist in the design that haven't been closed out. Any construction risks, any operational risks, any maintainable risks, and any disposal risks. Obviously, from a disposal point of view, we can't know how things will be done in, say, 40 years' time. So disposal risks are those risks associated with what we know today. If you look at I mentioned before, the documentation that you get on clothing and garments, or if you buy a new phone, you'll see there's quite a bit of information about how to dispose things like batteries and the phone itself and all these other things. So you can see the effects of the harmonisation in law and how it's affecting just normal consumer products. Okay, going through quickly, it's associated documentation. So there's a whole list there. The presentation will be available. The four at the top are the main ones that are directly related, and all these other documents are either associated or supporting in that process. Yeah, and any questions, I open up the line now. And thank you for your participation today. You got any questions?
Yeah, Gavin, Dan Houghton here, just wondering, I mean, we do a lot of brownfields work, a lot of
Dan,
small brownfield work. Yes, hello, can you hear me? Yeah, you can't hear me?
No worries. If we've got no more, got no questions, I'll leave it there, but certainly I'm on email, or give me a call on mobile. Happy to talk to anybody about any aspect here. In a 1 hour presentation, it's hard to get through all the documentations and explain what's going on. Dan, for some reason I can't hear you.
Hello, you can't hear me? Hello? Hello, you can't hear me?
We've got a message, but for some reason I can't hear you at all. Dan and others, if you have a question, please get hold of me after this. I'm more than happy to talk to you. Yeah, unfortunately, I can't seem to hear anyone else. There's something wrong with my system here. But and that presentation will be available for others if you once they're released. Thanks a lot, guys, and I'll leave it there.